G'day and welcome to the Patently Strategic Podcast, where we discuss all things at the intersection of business, technology, and patents. This podcast is a monthly discussion amongst experts in the field of patenting. It is for inventors, founders, and IP professionals alike, established or aspiring. And in today's episode, we pick up right where we left off last month with another, but equally important look into the world of enablement. This topic harkens back to the fundamental deal of the patent system. Long-term progress of science and the useful arts is promoted by trading a government-granted window of exclusivity to inventors in exchange for an enabling public disclosure that teaches the public how to make and use the invention. This predictably leads to some tension in the system. Inventors understandably want the broadest possible and most future-proof coverage for their ideas. The health of the broader public innovation ecosystem, however, depends on not wholesale blocking of iteration and competition by granting exclusive rights that can go well beyond what was specifically invented in the scope of any given granted patent. One place in particular this tension arises is in an area of patent law referred to as means plus function claiming. To someone newer to the world of IP, this is yet another terribly unintuitive turn of phrase. But fear not, we'll unpack that in just a bit. For now, suffice it to say that it is another semantic sharp corner alive and well in our court system, with two significant Federal Circuit Court rulings as recent as this past spring. There's a tremendous amount of nuance in these rulings, in this tension, and in the general understanding surrounding means plus function claiming, to the point of seeming overly pedantic at first glance. But it's important to remember that word choice matters a great deal in the world of patenting. You're using the English language to draw a picture around highly technical concepts. The precision with which this is done, down to the semantic level, can make all of the difference when it comes to your patent application being rejected or granted, and the future likelihood of your ability to assert your rights or defend against invalidation. Word choice too narrow or overly specific, and you can easily be designed around by competitors. Word choice too broad and only describing what something is versus what it does, and you risk rejection or invalidation for what will be ruled as linguistic tricks to get more coverage than what you actually invented. The tension is real and the case law interpretation is fluid, but it all still comes down to determining if the chosen words will enable a person of ordinary skill in the art to carry out an invention, in the interest of other inventors being able to build on the idea, while also avoiding trespassing with infringement. In this month's episode, Dr. Ashley Sloat, President and Director of Patent Strategy here at Aurora, leads a discussion along with our all-star patent panel into the nuanced world of means plus function claiming. The group digs into the statute, explores relevant case law and an analysis of the kinds of word choices that have and haven't caused problems for inventors, and also provides some great drafting tips for de-risking the use of means plus function claim language. Ashley is joined today by our always exceptional group of IP experts, including Kristen Hansen, Patent Strategist at Aurora, Dr. David Jackrell, President of Jackrell Consulting, David Cohen, Principal at Cohen Sciences, and Shelley Couturier, Patent Strategist and Search Specialist. Now, before joining the group, as we often do, we'd like to provide a short primer on key concepts in this episode for those newer to the world of patenting. In breaking this down, there's a lot of talk in the episode about what's described in the spec or specification versus what's written in the claims. We review this distinction in the prior episode on American Axle and take an even deeper dive in our patent anatomy episode from season 1. But in brief, the specification describes the invention and provides context for interpreting the claims. The claims are the heart of the application and point out the exact invention boundaries of what the applicant believes she's entitled to, specifically what the patent covers. Now moving on to statute scope. When patents are examined by the Patent Office or later litigated in a courtroom, several sections of U.S. statute come into play in determining if the claims in the patent are eligible, useful, novel, non-obvious, and enabled, or properly described. Patents can be rejected or invalidated if one or more of the claims are determined to be otherwise. Problems fall under Title 35 of U.S. Code, and this episode centers around Section 112, which is largely concerned with enablement, or describing the invention in sufficient detail to allow it to be practiced by someone skilled in the art without undue experimentation. Subsection F of Section 112 addresses the use of functional language in patent claims. With many conditions that our panel will cover, U.S. patent law does provide provisions for using functional language, or what something functionally does versus the more traditional approach that defines the structure or the how it does it of the invention. Another way of saying this is a claim is functional when it describes a feature by what it does versus what it is. So why is this referred to as means plus function claiming? Despite it not being the only trigger, These claims originally appeared as phrases worded like a means to turn on a light bulb. So literally, quote, a means, unquote, followed by, or plus, some functional outcome. This generic language provides no specificity as to how the bulb is turned on, potentially including structural elements like switches and copper wires, but instead encompasses all possible means by which a bulb can be turned on. While use of this type of language and its equivalents is legally in play, as you'll learn in the discussion, corresponding structure must still be found or commonly inferred if the claim is not at risk of being ruled indefinite by the patent office or courts. So the last bit of context we'd like to provide is around the word nonce, which practitioners use with regularity, and this episode is no exception. To get around the literal means plus function analysis being triggered by the literal use of the words means for in a claim, people started using slightly more specific language and applications. And I do emphasize slightly, these generic words and verbal constructs were still often void of structure and lacked definite meaning, mechanism, module, device, unit, component, element, member, apparatus, machine, system. These are referred to as nonce words. And just like they're a means for cousin, can all kick off a world of hurt if not properly supported with enabling structure. All right, that's hopefully enough to send you on your way into the nuanced world of functional claiming. As with most things, this is a concept that is neither inherently good nor bad, but knowing what to look for, how to safely leverage it, and when to avoid it altogether are key ingredients to staying calm and patenting on. Now, without further ado, take it away, Ashley.
All right, so getting to the real issue at hand, which is means plus function claiming and kind of the state of that and where we're at. And I try to kind of break today's discussion into device MPF versus software MPF because there are some nuances to each, I think. But in general, kind of the same overarching rules apply. We can see that in the last, 70 years now, that the number of patents that include means for claim limitations have dropped precipitously over time. And I would bet that trend continues into this day, or maybe kind of levels off at about 5% or so. So it's definitely not as common as it used to be, but I definitely, you still see it. I know that I still occasionally throw in some means language into a set of claims, not to say it's the only set of claims, but I still kind of do it just because I feel like it provides maybe some breadth for some things in the spec that you didn't, actually claim, but maybe you could still capture what that means for language. But like I said, there's definitely some sharp corners to this as well. So in general, section 112F or paragraph 6 of the MPEP describes what mean plus function is. So, it's section 112F is applied if you recite a function without reciting structure for performing the function, and then it limits the claims to the structure, materials, or acts disclosed in the specification or equivalents thereof. And it's not applicable, section 112F is not applicable if you recite both a function and the structure for performing that function. And so a lot of times what a lot of the case law that I read when the courts in particular, and I guess I don't, I haven't read enough about what examiners are doing, but in courts in particular, when they're trying to identify whether means plus function applies and whether you have sufficient disclosure to support that means plus function language, they basically determine the claimed function. So they basically say, okay, what's the means term, right? Is it some kind of means for doing something? So what are all the functions that means is performing? So maybe it's one function, two functions, four functions. And then they try to identify the corresponding structures in the written description that perform that function. And if they can only find one function, if they can only find support for one of the multiple functions, it's found indefinite. So I think it's really interesting in thinking about, if you are to use means plus function language, making sure that you're clear on all the different functions that you're giving that means, and then making sure that each of those functions has structure in the specification. So, how do you get around MPF, or how do you navigate it? So if means is not used, it must be shown that persons of ordinary skill in the art would not have understood those term limitations to connote structure And so that's what they kind of have to prove is that, okay, so you didn't use the word means, but you used some other potential, means like word. So now it's, there is the burden probably of the examiner of the court to say, well, somebody of ordinary skill wouldn't understand that had any structure to it. If an MPF determination is not desired, then the applicant needs to show that a particular claim element would be understood as connoting structure. And so, it's just this kind of balance of, again, trying to make sure that there's sufficient structure in the description to support that means plus function language. And this kind of use of means plus function dates all the way back. I mean, the Morse code is, I think, one of the earliest ones where they kind of talked about a means of, transmitting, was it like electromagnetism or whatever it was to kind of send signals, send words, and I think that was ultimately, I can't remember if it was, actually back at that time or just later, and, people kind of retroactively looking at things, but that there wouldn't have been sufficient structure even in that application to support the breadth of the claims that were in the Morse code patent. But one of the more somewhat recent, in the last half century or so, is this Halliburton Oil versus Walker. And so in this case, it was the late 1920s, and the oil industry was experimenting with different sound echo time methods for measuring the distance to the fluid surface in deep oil wells. And so the claims in this application were the product of experimentation upon this Lear and Wyatt patent. And so the invention basically added a mechanical acoustical resonator to the prior art device for measuring that distance to the fluid surface in deep oil wells. And so you can see here the claims recited a means associated with said pressure responsive device for tuning said receiving means to the frequency of echoes from the tubing collars of said tubing sections to clearly distinguish the echoes from said couplings from each other. And ultimately, the Supreme Court invalidated Walker's mean plus function claims because they said it was improper to claim the most crucial element in terms of what it will do rather than in the terms of its own physical characteristics or its arrangement in the new combination apparatus. So none of the claims described the physical relation of the Walker edition to that of the old Lear and Wyatt machine. None of the claims described the manner in which the Walker edition would operate together with the prior art machine to make a new apparatus. And so, ultimately the claims failed. And so, again, just kind of, I use this more as a historical one. I didn't deep dive into this case, but just kind of this historical perspective, this is where the MPF field has kind of been going. The most, I think, notable case of recent is this Williams versus Citrix. And this was in 2015. And the reason I think this one has gotten a lot more fanfare, or at least, play in internet and stuff like that, is that they started, so historically, if you used the term means, it was presumed that it was a section 112F means plus function claim. If you didn't use the word means, it was a very strong presumption that 112F didn't apply. This Williams versus Citrix online case shifted away from that and basically saying that there's now no longer a strong presumption against a means plus function interpretation in the absence of the means language. And it also established the nonce word doctrine. And I know David Cohen and I talked about this the other day, and I have a whole slide about nonce words and non-nonce words. But what this case, so ultimately, actually, let me take a step back here. So Williamson had invented software for connecting one or more presenters with geographically remote audience members. And so in their claims, they had a distributed learning control module. So obviously nothing with means. Their means plus function word was a module, a distributed learning control module. And so the district court had evaluated the specification and concluded that there were no necessary algorithms in the spec for performing those claimed functions. And ultimately, the Federal Circuit upheld and found that the term distributed learning control module was indefinite, because they basically said that, one of ordinary skill in the art wouldn't know what kind of meaning or what, kind of structure that this module would have connoted. And this basically led to that heightened burden to, make sure that you have the structure. And in particular, and I'll get into this later, but particularly for software, you can see in a lot of the case law that they really want for something that is interpreted as means plus function in the software world, you need to have structure and or algorithms that define what that means plus function word or term is. And so that's kind of what they failed here, is there just was nothing, there's no algorithms or anything like that that fully, gave the metes and bounds of that distributed learning control module.
Right. Ashley, let me add in here, and we're
please.
very familiar with this. And it's painful. Williamson v. Citrix, remember, was the first time that software was called into play to say, these modules and these means for language pieces are not properly supported in specs as we see them. So if you do a means for in kind of a mechanical case, one skilled in the art might understand that a fastener could be 40 different things, even if your spec did not list all of those things. You may be able to stretch something because one skilled in the art would stretch something. But with software, you have no idea what that algorithm might have been. You have no idea what it means when somebody says decision module or decision engine or decider thing or anything that you say module engine or whatnot. If you don't fully explain that in your specification, there's no support for it. So it isn't just messy claim language, it's just poor spec writing. And this case brought that to the forefront because as a software prosecutor, you can quickly write up flowcharts. But if those flowcharts aren't supported by what the modules are that are performing those pieces, and or if you don't take the time to kind of get those examples in there, it's just too light. It's not supported, and you're going to get these rejections all over the place. So a lot of people who are a little bit newer to software drafting, I would say probably after 2012, maybe even later than that, they will shy away from using means for and using module even or anything like that in their block diagrams and their flowcharts because they do not want to take the time to make sure that's properly supported for the means for language, and they don't want to have it on their file histories. So sometimes you will get these rejections, but it's fine because you've done your job, your spec is good, everything's appropriate, and it's supported. But sometimes you get these rejections and you have to check that, and you may have to, remove it from your claim language because you don't have the proper support. So some people will shy away from that, but old school software drafting, you will see module all over the place. You will see means for, and there are a lot of practitioners who still do this, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a little dicier, and it's a little more difficult to make sure your specification meets the standards.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Kristen. Yeah, and the thing that came through to me most was that, again, just finding all those functions and making sure there's like a full flowchart algorithm or whatever that clearly supports that function. So that, just making sure you got all those functions vetted out.
Yep. Even if it's the dumbest flowchart you've ever seen, 3 boxes of do this, do X, and do Y. I mean, it just has to be in there. And it's support. Sometimes you need it deeper than that, but.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So that kind of brings up the nonce words versus non-nonce words. And of course, this is not a exhaustive list, right? But, and obviously words like module, mechanism, unit, component, element, member, apparatus, machine, system are kind of void of structure, right? Because there's so many things that could be considered any one of those things. From a non-nonce word, that must sound like nonsense, non-nonce words. Words like circuit, detent mechanism, digital detector, reciprocating member, connecting assembly, sealingly connected joints. Obviously, the thing that I kind of found in some of these was that the nonce words had non-structural modifier, sometimes like a non-structural adjective and a non-structural term. So if you kind of said I don't know, like a reciprocating system, maybe that would work. Maybe it's more structural. I'm trying to think of even an example. If anybody has one, shout it out. But, on the other side of the non-nonce words, there's clearly a structural modifier and a non-structural term. So, a digital detector, obviously, detector has some level of structure in it. So a detent has some level of structure in it. A circuit has some level of structure in it. And so the more that you have some sort of structural component to the term, the better. But what you don't want is, stacking up all these adjectives that are directly tied to the means, or these non-structural modifiers that are attached to the means, or some other nonce word. And that seems where, a lot of people kind of get in trouble or end up kind of in this means plus function interpretation.
Do you think that configured to would also be a nonce word?
I think it can be, but again, it depends on what that function, if you're saying like an element configured to, and maybe that configured to language gives it some structure, if it's an element configured to attach element A to element B, or, to attach a shaft to a base, then, maybe that element could be considered, less of a nonce word, because the structural feature is there's, clearly some kind of maybe fastening means or something like that, because it's connecting, it's, affixing this shaft to this base. But if you're, from a software perspective, for example, if you're like, an element configured to identify a user, well, like, what is that? Is that a device? Is that some kind of algorithm? Is it a sensor? Is it, like, what is that? And so I think it kind of depends what comes after configured.
Yeah, coming from the other side of the software side, I rarely use configured to unless I'm tying it to the processor doing it. So processor configured to, or processor and memory configured to carry out these instructions. I'll use it there, but I'll rarely use it within my claim body.
I'm sorry, say that again. You would use it where?
I would use it in like a preamble where I'm saying I have a processor configured, to carry. Yep.
Right.
But I wouldn't use it in the body very often for software, if at all. It's the same issue. It has to have a little bit more support, a little bit stronger tie to exactly which algorithm is configured to, why it's configured to, and what the actual steps are. Rather than if I say an algorithm that includes, A, B, and C, and I just call out A, B, and C, and I have a processor that can do it, and that's fine. But if I say configured to, I have to describe what I mean by configured to.
All right.
Yeah, like a special processor, potentially,
or is it pre-programmed? Is it an FPGA, right? Is it changeable? There's all kinds of just weird, odd things that pop up in the software world for using configured to.
So I'm going to walk through a little bit of case law for, like I said, some kind of like of the device world and a little bit for the software world. So the Gregory-Barron versus Medical Device Technologies case, Federal Circuit 210. So basically, Barron invented an automated biopsy instrument. So basically, the device that he was trying to protect was charged by pulling back an external guide, which was attached to the cannula along the shaft until the guide locks in place. The locking function was a lever that would slide into a slot. Pressing the other end of the lever would release the lock and allow the spring to send the cannula forward over the stylet. So it's basically like for taking a biopsy sample. And so in Barron's spec, or in their claims, they had a release means for retaining the guide in the charged position. And so when they did the claim construction, they basically said, again, what are the functions? It has a release function and a retaining function, right? Retaining the guide in the charged position and releasing the guide from the charged position. Now, Barron tried to say, no, it's only one function, that the other one, that I think it was that the releasing part was just a modifier, but they said, no, it has both these functions. And unfortunately, what they had in the spec did not support, they didn't have sufficient structure to support both of those. And so, from a literal infringement in this case perspective, they needed to find a device that performed both of those structures, or, some kind of equivalent function, and they couldn't. So not only were the claims indefinite, but there was also no infringement because, again, that means term was determined to have two functions, and those functions were not fully supported by the spec. And then for tech licensing court versus video tech, so, this one was interesting because they described a monitoring means in the spec, which described a node-to-node communication system. And so they did have, so expert testimony can also obviously support what one of skill in the art would have thought, how much structure, whatever term connoted. And so they did have an expert that testified that the controllers and the circuitry that were in the spec were, very much the corresponding structure. There was no circuit diagram, but, the necessity of having a circuit diagram is dependent on the level of one of skill in the art. So this one was found to be definite because there was sufficient structure. And so I think one of the more interesting quotes from this case was that the question is not whether one of skill in the art would be capable of implementing a structure to perform the function, but whether that person would understand the written description itself to disclose such a structure. So again, the whole crux of the patent system is to enable one of skill in the art to make and use the invention. And if you don't have enough structure in there for them to make and use the invention, then, not to say that they couldn't figure it out and couldn't, with some experimentation figure it out, but ultimately you're not holding up your end of the bargain, and you're not, you're not providing the means for that person to make and use it. So this is some interesting, advice. So, tools for checking whether 112F applies, or how to bolster up your specification in the sense that, in the world that you decide to use means plus function language is, obviously make sure that the spec denotes structure, right? Make sure you have structure in your spec for all the functions that those terms have. Also look to dictionaries, both, basic dictionaries and field-specific dictionaries to determine whether the noun that you're using denotes structure as well. You may find that if you look up a reciprocating member, that's very clearly known to have some kind of structure associated with it. So it's better that that's the case than the alternative, right, of it not having any structure. And then again, find evidence of that structure for, the term in the prior art. So is there, prior art references, literature, patents, whatever, that when people have used that term, it connotes some kind of structure. And again, so if, all these things are true, then even if you use means plus function language, you should be in a pretty good spot for it having the support it needs to be found definite. So turning a little bit to software means plus function. So there was a few different cases, and I kind of just put through these all on one slide, just because, the short of it is that a lot of them were found definite, and I'm not surprised. But so there was the Dyphon versus Target in 2022. This one was found definite. The means plus function terms were code, application, and system. In VDPP versus Visio, again, Federal Circuit 2022, storage and processor were found to be definite. And for these, it basically, turned on the fact that in some of them testimony that one of skill in the art would understand that these terms had some sort of structure, especially in the system one with Target. It was, something around like you're in a Target, you're walking around, you're over by the vacuums, and you all of a sudden get a vacuum specific advertisement or coupon or whatever for the vacuum. So it allowed for different targeted advertising essentially within a confined structure. So in this case, the system was essentially kind of, a system within a building, the building having kind of different wireless detectors and, and things like that. And so it was very clear that that system had structure. And then, one of skill in the art from a code, application, storage, and processor perspective understands what those things are. I don't know to what degree they described the processor, for example, if it was just clear that it was, an off-the-shelf processor, or if it was, some kind of configured processor, maybe they had algorithms in there to support that processor, nonce word. But suffice it to say, it was found definite. When you look at Blackboard versus Desire to Learn in 2009, they use an access control manager language. And again, this one was found indefinite. It's because they could not find any structure that a person of skill in the art would have understood to have structure. And so one of the things that they, basically said, and I think Kristen would agree with this, is that you have to avoid using thin disclosures for even those elements known in the art. And I think that especially goes toward these top ones, the Dyphon versus Target and VDPP versus Visio, is that obviously code, application, storage, processor are pretty well-known technology in the art. That does not mean that you are exempt from describing them to enable somebody in the art. You need to still provide, is it, like Kristen said, is it some kind of generic computer? Is it some kind of, more specifically programmed processor? And in the case that it is, specially programmed, what are the algorithms that allow it to be specially programmed? If it's generic, what are the algorithms that it's performing that, allow it to act as an access control manager or something like that? So,
right. Yeah, and we don't get dinged as often on storage system code, processor, that sort of thing, because we put boilerplate in for that, exactly that reason. But you could make your boilerplate for an access control manager just by going through one iteration of how you're controlling access in one paragraph, and you could probably pull in each component that's involved, whether it's software or hardware or both. It's just, you have to remember to do it, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
We get writing a block diagram because we need a name to call something. And so we have a manager here and an engine here and an application here. And we forget sometimes to put the details in that, and then we forget to tie it together too. So there's kind of two components there.
Yeah. And I think in this case, if I recall correctly, but I might be mixing it up with another one, but this is one where they had some access control support description in the spec, for I think around passcodes and things like that. But then for the specific function or one of the functions that the access control manager controlled, there was no tying in the spec of that passcode function to that other function or something. So again, it was one of those weird things where they had said, well, it's our understanding that this is all the functions of the access control manager. And while yes, the passcode is one, how that's, works is one structural component for these functions, it doesn't suffice for these other functions. So again, I think that's where it gets tricky too, is I think that's a big interpretation part, is what are all the functions that they are going to believe, like the courts or whatever, that term provides, all those functions that it does. And are those the same functions that you believe that it's doing? Because if those aren't in alignment, then you're going to have a definite, disclosure issue.
Yeah, that's exactly in line with the advice that I got, on means plus function language, just in general in claims, is to really mirror that language almost exactly in the specification. So if you have like means for comparing this input to this output, then in the spec you would say means for comparing this input to this output can include, you know what I mean? And then you list it out really explicitly with all your structure and stuff like that. It sounds like kind of similar to what Kristen was saying on the boilerplate language, and that some of these cases that Ashley, you've been going over, it's part of it's not having the support, but part of it is not being clear what the means scope is in a way.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, when I draft, I still really like to do claims early on, and then I plop those into the spec. That's not to say that I'm not going to add, 16 paragraphs up front to kind of give, breadth and, different versions of things and kind of this overarching view of everything. But then when you do that, you at least have that, what everybody has agreed to as the most important thing, at least currently. And then you can build all the alternatives, but kind of within, making sure you have that language, that claim language support, then also can build, tie those alternatives directly to the base language. And so, because, when you kind of, in my experience, it's such a pain when you do things in reverse, because then if you have a spec and you're doing claims, then you have to make sure you fully import that language back in there, and it just never ends up, I feel like, being as good as if the claims, at least one set was up front and then the spec drafted around those.
So Ashley, sometimes what I end up doing is adding the claims we generate after to the specification, but I try to add it in maybe its own examples, so I don't conflate what I had already done. There are obvious things where you only change a few words and you just go back and you change the vocabulary. But if we're adding 10 new claims, I will often just say, okay, we're going to put this in the flow chart and it's going to be another 2-page description, just because you never know.
Right.
You know, and maybe you wrote that 2 weeks ago, right? And so you really don't recall what you said, but.
No, that's a good point. Yeah. I mean, most clients I would bet would prefer an extra few hours spent on an extra few pages for, really making sure claims were supported versus, those same hours spent trying to smush it somewhere into the spec, but then like coming out of it being like, well, I think they're supported.
Right. Right. Well, and by that same token, if you have anybody reviewing work, like you and I, once in a while, will do that. And each of us will have to go back and massage the language, add some content, or at least outwardly say, like, I think I told you this week, hey, I haven't added this to the spec yet. See what you think of the claims. So at least, we try to like not duplicate the work, but.
Right. No, it's true. It's a fine balance. That's for sure. So then just a few more cases here. There was Media Rights Capital versus Capital One Financial Corp. And this was Media Rights had invented software for preventing the unauthorized recording of electronic media. And so they had used terms like compliance mechanism and a custom media device. And so, what the court had basically said was that the spec does describe how the compliance mechanism is connected to and interacts with the other components of the system, what processes the compliance mechanism performs, and what structural subcomponents might comprise the compliance mechanism. But they said ultimately the mechanism was tied to a general computer, and there was no corresponding algorithm for all the 4 functions. And so they still held it indefinite. So this one surprised me a little bit, just because, like, as it says there, verbatim from the synopsis was that, it said how it was connected with other components, how it interacted with other components, what processes it performed, what the structural components, some components might be, but there was no algorithms for each of the 4 functions. And so that just goes to show, even when you kind of place it into the ecosystem of the application of, this is how it kind of sits in the bigger picture of everything. If you still don't vet out those 4 functions or however many functions it performs, clearly vet them out, you're still going to be in trouble probably. And this is TechSec versus International Business Machines, or IBM. So TechSec had invented computer systems for securing computer data. And so they used words like system memory means and digital logic means. And so again, the court held that the system memory is a specific structure. Digital logic means was specifically disclosed in the specification to comprise structural elements, including system memory and specific modules and subsystems. And, I guess I didn't know this, Kristen probably knows this, but also, going back to what I said earlier around if there are dictionaries, especially field-specific dictionaries, look in there and see what structure, that dictionary puts together with whatever term you're looking up. So in this world, because the first when I read this, I was like, structural elements, system memory, specific modules. I was like, how is that definite? Like, that seems just BS to me, right? But when you look up, I guess, digital logic, a skilled artisan would know that to mean digital circuits that perform Boolean algebra. Like,
right, it's gates. It's
like, I was like, all
transistor
right.
gates, basically.
Fair enough. All right.
Yeah, so it's weird. It's weird to think of that as actual hardware, right? Because it's all on our computers. We think it's running in software, and some of it is, right? You do have software-enabled processing. It's not all just hardware. You can make these algorithms that function on hardware, but they function as a soft processor, right? So it's not fully clear.
And that's why we need a definite structure.
Yep.
All right. And then the last case I had was NOAA Systems versus Intuit. So NOAA Systems basically described an automated financial accounting system. The system would allow businesses or individuals to connect to the computers of companies with which that entity conducts business, so that information regarding financial transactions could be transmitted between them. So I kind of liken this to, like, you go into Wise, or even like your bank has these modules where you can put in information and then you can connect between different banks or, things like that. And so they had described access means and communication means in their claims, but there was no algorithm disclosed for one of the two functions for these. And so, they basically said there are really two functions recited, providing access to the file, and then once access is provided, enabling the performance of delineated operations. And so what they were saying is basically any algorithm had to address both of those. But unfortunately, that was not the case. They didn't have the support for it. And so the court basically said to avoid purely functional claiming in cases involving computer implemented inventions, we have consistently required that the structure disclosed in the spec be more than simply a general purpose computer. And then consequently, a means plus function claim element for which the only disclosed structure is a general purpose computer is invalid if the specification fails to disclose an algorithm for performing that function. So again, just really hits, like home run, like dead on its face, like super clear, right, of what they want. Yeah. So anyway, so the kind of some of the tips that I, kind of thought about, in how I, so I don't do this. I don't do means plus function very often because, in general, I was kind of brought up in the world that, it's just not something you do. But I do recognize the value in having like I said, maybe a claim set that has some means plus function language. But, I would, sprinkle in means plus function, make sure it's not the only claim type, but, you can maybe sprinkle it in a little bit and assume that terms will be construed as MPF and draft accordingly. So now in this world where, if you use the term means, 112F certainly applies. If you don't use means, there's a strong presumption that it doesn't apply. That's no longer the truth, right? That's no longer the case. If you use non-means terms, there's still a likelihood that it can be construed as a means plus function term. So you kind of have to take this view that anytime you're using anything that's remotely close to a nonce word, that assume that it's going to be viewed as means plus function either by the examiner or by a later court body, and make sure that you draft accordingly. And then even structures known in the art should be given structure in the description. I think that one kind of surprised me, through all of this, research and stuff. And then for software, include algorithms for all the functions for that means plus function term. And so like Kristen said, even if it's, here's the functions, I'm going to do some lame flowchart for each of them, at least there is something there that kind of shows, what inputs are being received, what's being done with those inputs, and then what the output is. And so that you have that very literal description.
Yeah, and one more thing to add there, I always find it very interesting that that is kind of the requirement for an application to get through and to be allowed. And then as soon as you file a continuation, of course, your flowchart is non-existent because you can't add new matter, but you happen to pull it from the spec language, but they're fine with that in a continuation or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10, right? So it's kind of interesting as you prosecute further in a family that, it just gets a little lighter for what they require. Well,
Kristen, do you mean adding flowcharts later, do you mean?
You can't. So if you were to write a set of claims that doesn't have a flowchart, because now let's say you write a continuation
I see what you mean. Okay.
Right, that has 5 different end steps than your first flowchart and first claim. You have support for it likely because you described it.
Right.
But like in Europe, if you didn't describe it in one embodiment and if you're pulling that from 5 areas of the spec, it won't fly. So in the US, they really kind of say it's fast and loose. That's fine. It's in there. You have the language, even though you didn't tie it to the same permutation.
Right.
So it's interesting. It's also why I don't often do a lot of divisionals in Europe unless it's a specifically different claim set than what I've already gotten allowed.
Right. Well, these get so increasingly expensive too.
Yes.
But yeah, it's tricky. And I think that's where you also have to, if the budget and time allows and all that good stuff, working with the inventor or the companies to understand this is the current iteration, but what do future iterations? And if there's one, like we're for sure going to do this in the next 2 years, this other way of doing it, we're only doing it this way now because, it was the cheapest, fastest way to market, but we're going to do it this other way later. then
Mhm.
making sure you have those flow charts for that later implementation, or like at least really, really good support
Yeah.
to avoid this kind of stuff.
Yeah, the other thing that I was going to add is like, I find myself using functional language. I don't know about often, but sometimes, because especially if a client has described a few different alternatives to do something and they really want the breadth, in the independent claim, I'll use the functional language to kind of cover 3 or 4 different embodiments. But then a lot of times I'll use dependent claims to clarify that and
That's a good
say,
idea.
wherein this thing is, then get it, ditch the functional language and use the structural language in the dependent claims. And I guess my thought or hope is that it's even further clarifying and supporting the definiteness, of the functional language in the independent claim.
Agreed.
No,
And remember,
I like
it's
that.
not bad language. It's just not bad language. You just have to take care when using it. And if you get to a point where it's just easier to write out those dependent claims, and then you can only file 20, just pull them out and put them in the spec only. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I really like that. I think we, as practitioners, kind of sometimes forget the value in dependent claims. And that mean like, obviously from a like the claim set perspective, the value, but the giving the breadth value of dependent claims. I think it's easy to kind of be focused on the dependent claims from a alternative embodiments and almost like explanation of like what different things are, what they mean, or giving structure. But I think kind of forgetting though too that they also, because there's a dependent claim that's narrower than the independent claim, then by virtue of that dependency, you have this great breadth in the independent claim. So if you can import that same relationship into the spec, then you're also kind of similarly giving that same breadth and relationship, and that, then like that disclosure and that definiteness. All right, well, that is all I had for you all today. I'm glad that everybody seemed, participatory and into it. Nobody fell asleep, so that's a win.
No, using this language and software makes me sweat. I do it because I've worked with many older practitioners, like old school practitioners who like it and want that coverage. But every time I do it, I have to, double check everything I've done when it comes to a claim like that. So.
Yeah, I haven't done it much. I think the one that comes to mind was, some like language around a sensor module, but I think that has, because a sensor is the kind of the modifying term, that I think it connotes a decent amount of structure that obviously there's sensors. I mean, you still have to kind of say what that sensor module is doing and, what things perform that function. In that case, you're probably tying it to some specific sensor, but yeah.
So, just thinking aloud here, this whole discussion seems to be similar or analogous in a way to the question of product by process versus product composition, right? Do you think there's been? Do you see that as an analogy also? Product. You make a product. Here's a product which is made this way. I mean, and really, it's a method claim, and it's much fuzzier than if you just recite the composition.
And this is, I haven't, kind of looked into case law around product by process. If a product by process claim, could somebody be found infringing if they did a similar process but didn't end up with the product? I don't know where, like in the chemical arts, I imagine that could be a place where that happens. Probably not in a lot of other arts, but I mean, obviously, it's assuming you're performing all the process steps. But,
My understanding of product by process claims is that the process limitations are more or less irrelevant, and that if someone makes the same product by a different process, or if that's in the prior art, let's say, then the claim wouldn't be allowable. So I almost never use those for that reason. But again, I'm not that familiar with all the latest case law on that either.
Yeah. Okay.
Sounds like an opening, David Cohen for another presentation.
Let me walk that back.
Hey, it's
No,
been
I
recorded.
Yeah, I like it. I would love to hear something on that because I hardly ever run across it. So
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. It was a good dynamic discussion, so I love it. So,
Thank you, Ashley.
all right.
Yeah,
Thanks, Ashley. It's a great topic.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and remember to check us out at auropatents.com for more great podcasts, blogs, and videos covering all things patent strategy. And if you're an agent or attorney and would like to be part of the discussion or an inventor with a topic you'd like to hear discussed, email us at podcast@auropatents.com. Do remember that this podcast does not constitute legal advice, and until next time, keep calm and patent on.